I'm Marnie Webb, and this is my colleague, Steve Lee. We work for a nonprofit organization called TechSoup. It's our mission to help other civil society organizations all over the world be able to get and use technology. And as a part of that work, we've had an opportunity with a grant from google.org to work with Data Commons and understand how the data that's in Data Commons and the tools that surround Data Commons can be used by a civil society to achieve their own goals. So we're going to share some of what we've learned in working through that today. Steve and I also work for a part of the organization that actually builds tools. So community design is a big part of our process. We go into communities and work with them to articulate what they need out of technology and then build tools to meet those needs. And we're taking a really similar approach with this Data Commons work. So we're going in and working with organizations that, say, run food pantries or something similar and saying, okay, where are the places you might be asking questions of public data so that we can go through and sort of organize entry points for them and visualizations and ways of access that make sense to them. So that's the heart of the work that we do. Today, we're going to go through, and I'm going to just provide a quick description of Google's Data Commons, some of the ways that you can explore using the tool as it exists today. And then most of the session will be sort of demoing some of the more sophisticated ways to access and use the data that's in Data Commons. Does that sound like what people expected they were going to have when they walked in the room? Awesome. So first off, what is Google's Data Commons? So it allows basically anybody with an internet connection to be able to get at and use these vast public data sets. For somebody that's not necessarily I have a lot of technological imagination, but not so much technical skill, and the ability to go in and compare data across different data sets, so it's already been normalized and I can look at it in a single graph, is tremendously powerful. Furthermore, the ability to pull out some of that data and put it in a spreadsheet, which is the data environment in which I'm most comfortable, and then be able to manipulate it in combination with my own data is also possible and exciting. So what Data Commons has three basic elements. The first part is Google's public Data Commons. It's the Data Commons that is at datacommons.org. It's where Google engineers have brought in these data sets and normalized them and organized them so that you can explore the data right there in that tooling with nothing more than a pretty fast internet connection, but an internet connection. The second part is a framework for publishing data. Again, from our perspective in civil society, this is also exciting because it means that the data isn't limited to data that's been published and is important enough for Google engineers to spend their time normalizing it, which tends to be data that's in very large data sets. It's published by governments, health organizations, those kinds of entities. It means the small nonprofits that we work with day in and day out can actually have a schema that they can put around their data so they can contribute it to Data Commons as well. And then a suite of tools that allows you to access that data and manipulate it. That can be setting up your own instance of Data Commons, which is something we've done. It can be using the tools so that you can embed charts on other sites or using the APIs for a variety of storytelling purposes. One of the things that, so there's this paper that we linked to in the resources that opened up my idea about what Data Commons is this core concept of layering that allows you to more easily join data across different instances of Data Commons. So if you take Google's public Data Commons, where they've published and normalized all this data, and then you take the Data Commons that we set up, we're able to pull in some of the data from Google's Data Commons and can put data in our own instance using the same schema so that we can join these. And then you can keep going with different layers of data so that you're able to pull data across these different instances. It's the lift of setting up your own Data Commons instance is not insignificant, but this concept means that you can also pull data from all of these different instances into a different environment if you choose to do that because you want to work with it there. Whether it's into, like I was saying, spreadsheets, whether it's into other geospatial tools, it gives you an ability to join and work with this data. in whatever tool you actually want to use, more or less. I'm looking at Steve to make sure I'm right. So just on exploring data commons, there's a lot of ways that you can get it in and dive into the data there in the website itself. The easiest ones to start with are the Statistical Variable Explorer. There are like 90,000 different variables in there. So that's like using that to explore like all the different variables is not an insignificant task, but it lets you dive into what's there and what isn't there. The Place Explorer, a Map Explorer, and a Timeline Explorer. So this is an example of the Place Explorer for Oklahoma. So you can put in a place and it shows you the variables associated with that place in a way that it believes you will find interesting and insightful. This can be a good starting place for exploring data because it lets you see what data is available because it's not equal across all places. And then you can go in and you can look at something more specific, like using the Map Explorer. So in this instance, this is all tornado events over a period of time across Oklahoma. It was not intentional to have a Wizard of Oz theme, but that's how it worked out. But you're able to look at that, and you can broaden that view. So you can say, oh, show me what it looks like in neighboring states or across the US. And you can also take the same data and put it on a timeline. So it's all the same set of data that you're able to explore in different ways, and you can also export it. So that's just intended to be a quick overview of what Data Commons is and some of what's available to you. And I think, unless there are any questions or anybody has a comment, we'll get into the workshop part of it.
Sounds great. All right, hey everybody, Steve, and I'm gonna just build on what Marnie was talking about and actually show you what this looks like in a hands-on demo. So when I first started using Data Commons, I admit I was quite overwhelmed at all the data that was in Data Commons and all the different ways there were of getting to that data and using that data. I was super excited when the Data Commons team rolled out their natural language interface for Data Commons. I think that makes for a fantastic starting place if you want to explore what kind of information is in Data Commons. Let's take a look to see what that looks like. So here's the Data Commons website. And let's say that you're interested in transportation issues here in the Bay Area. It actually took Marnie and I like 2.5 hours to drive down here from Berkeley this morning. So maybe we're interested in commute times. We can just ask Data Commons a question like, how much time do people spend commuting in Santa Clara County? And you'll see that Data Commons will come back and it will return a bunch of interesting visualizations and data about commute times. And in addition to information about commute times, it will know that there are other related data sets that might be interesting, data points that might be interesting to this query. So there's information about people who are driving alone, taking public transportation, different types of commuting, even information about people who are working at home. All of this stuff is super relevant and a great way to explore this data. And of course, you can follow up with additional questions. How does this compare to Alameda County, which is where I live? And Data Commons will take that previous query and add some additional comparisons here where you can visualize information about transportation between these two counties. So I think the natural language interface really lowers the barrier for people to really get into using Data Commons. But what if you want to look up data on your own? So there are two very important pieces of information that you need to know before you start looking up data in Data Commons. There's the place, and there's the statistical variable. So the place is obvious. It's the place where you want to find data, or the place for which you want to find data for. The statistical variable is the specific data that you want to get for that place. You might be wondering, how do you know what statistical variables are available in Data Commons? Marnie mentioned this statistical variable explorer. This is what it looks like. You'll see over here on the left side of the screen, there's a list of categories, and if you expand one of these categories, you'll see that there are a number of variables that you can choose from. So this is a great place to start if you want to learn about a particular kind of data. You can filter it using this box here, or if you want to get a sense of what kind of data sources these variables correspond to, you can filter it by the data source here. Once you click on a variable, you can get information about what kind of places is this variable available for, what was the original data source, and what are the time ranges. So let's put all this together, and let's say you're interested in mental health issues in the United States. So this is Geo4Good, so let's see what that looks like on a map. Yeah.
So on the question about the commute time, can you actually plot one data against other? So can I say, give me commute time by distance?
That's a great question. So the question is, can you compare one data point against another? So looking at commute time versus commute distance, for example. The answer is yes, and let's take a look at what that looks like. First, in the case of, let's say we're looking at mental health issues, so that might be one variable, and we'll start with that. If you go to the Map Explorer, let's say I'm interested in the United States. We can select that here. And let's say we want to look at this information at the county level. So I'll select county. And I know that the variable that I'm interested in is under health, and it's a medical condition. And there's a variable here that is called percentage of population with poor mental health. Let's go ahead and select that. And you can see Data Commons will come back with a map of the United States. You'll notice that the counties that are shaded with a darker color will show areas that have a percentage of the population, have a greater percentage of the population with poor mental health. So going back to your question, how do you connect that to another data point? And I think that's really the power of Data Commons. It's really the magic of the tool, is that all the data sources have been put into a single knowledge graph, which makes it easy to connect these pieces of data together, especially data for geographic data that's connected to a place. You can do that through a scatter plot. And so let's say, in addition to looking at poor mental health, you want to see how that compares to income. So we'll look at the median income of a population. And here you can see a scatter plot where each of these dots here are a county, and you can see that there is kind of an interesting relationship here where it looks like counties that have a lower median income seem to have a higher percentage of population with poor mental health. So I think it's pretty insightful to be able to connect these two types of information together, and I think Data Commons is particularly helpful in doing that, since they've already connected these data points together.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
That's okay. So can you copy the same text based in the natural language processing toolbar and get this exact chart? And what if there isn't that data field? What does Data Commons generate? So for example, if I ask something like, give me commute time with the colors of cars.
Yeah. So I think there's two parts to that question. The first question was, if you see something in the natural language results, can you go back and interact with that information? Every chart that you see that comes back in the natural language results, there's a link there to explore, and that will take you to, for example, the scatter plot, where you can change the variables, change some other property of that. The second question is, what if that variable just isn't available, or the natural language results produce results that aren't really relevant to your request. So I think that's where the learning part of the AI comes in. Every result that you get in the natural language interface will have a way for providing feedback. And so you can provide feedback about how relevant the graphs were that you're getting back. There's also a feedback mechanism for if there are data points that aren't in data commons, to be able to share that with the data commons team, to be able to prioritize getting that information into data commons. All right, other questions at this point? Okay, and as Marnie mentioned, you can also look at a timeline view of this. So if you're interested to see how some of these values changed over time, here you can see the median income has risen over time. A little bit harder to tell with the mental health. It kind of seems like the percentage is inching up here. I can't imagine what could have happened in 2020 that might have caused this to rise up. But in any case, that gives you an idea of the tools that are available to you inside of data commons to be able to look at this data. And I think that you can get pretty far with the tools there, but a lot of times you're going to be interested in using your own tools. Many of you are using all kinds of tools to analyze data and to visualize data. And so you might be interested in how do I get data out of data commons so that I can use it in the tools that I'm already comfortable using. So let's talk about using data outside of data commons. So there's 3 ways that I'm going to talk about today that you can do that. The first way is just downloading the data as a CSV file. And I think that gives you the biggest flexibility in terms of being able to use that data in other tools. But there are other types of integrations as well. For example, if you use Google Sheets, there's an add-in for data commons that allows you to pull data directly into the Google Sheet without even having to go to data commons. And then the third option is you can take any chart that is available through data commons, and if you have a web page, you can just embed that chart on your own web page. So let's take a look at each of these items. So like I said, I think the kind of most flexible way of engaging with this data outside of data commons is to download the data into a format like CSV. You'll note that any chart that is displayed in data commons will have a download button. So for median income, for example, I can click on that, and I've got 2 options here. I can take the chart and just download it as an image, or if I want to get the underlying data, then I can click this button here, download data as CSV. Now, if you want more control over the kind of data that you're downloading, there is another tool called the data download tool. And this is where you can specify very precisely, for example, let's say we're interested in getting data for states in Brazil. You can put in the name of the place you're looking for. I'm going to select Administrative Area 1 here, which in Brazil corresponds to states. And let's say I'm interested in things like population density, maybe some information about literacy rates, and let's maybe do an environmental variable here. How about the number of floods? And so you can see these are all variables and data points that are coming from different sources, but you can download them all together in one sheet. Once you've selected the variables, you can press the preview button, and it'll give you a preview of what that CSV file will look like. For every state in Brazil, by the way, every place in data commons will have a data commons ID associated with it. So if you want to reference that particular place inside of data commons, you'll see that there's a DCID associated with that place. So in this case, we've got a list of states in Brazil. And for each variable that we selected, there are 3 pieces of information that we get back. We get back the year in which the data is being the data was observed. You get the value, the actual number, but you also get the source. So you know for every data point, where did that number come from? And so each of those 3 pieces of information you'll get for all of the variables that you chose. Once you're happy with how your preview looks, you can just press the download button and it'll download that file as a CSV.
I found amazing that you have the ID selected. It's only for places, or you also have this for example, if I'm asking something about a specific company, do you assign also IDs, like industrial IDs such as Bloomberg's?
Yeah. So I will say that every piece of information in Data Commons has a Data Commons ID associated with it. So if there's information about companies or other variables, all that will have an ID associated with it. The tools that I'm showing you today are really kind of geared towards data about statistics about places. And so in this case, all the places will have a particular format of a DCID, depending on if it's a country or a state or a city or a zip code. And the overall way of getting data into the system involves actually coming up with a good naming scheme for putting that kind of information in there.
If someone retracts a part of data and let's say re-uploads a modified or corrected version, does the DCID change, and what is the process for people to do retractions?
Yeah, so the DCID should never change. And in this case, you'll note that the DCID for places, for example, I think the best practice is to use a form for a DCID that corresponds to something related to that particular thing. So in this case, states in Brazil are the DCID that we're using is the actual ID that can be found in the Wikidata database. In the case of the United States, states and counties and even congressional districts, they're all coded based on the FIPS ID, if you're familiar with that. As far as being able to retract data, right now I think that's an area where I know the Data Commons team is doing a lot of work in creating simplified processes for being able to contribute data to Data Commons. And I imagine a part of that will involve processes for identifying if there's a data set that's wrong or should no longer be in there. I think, obviously, working through Google's public data commons, there's a bar that you have to meet in terms of the kind of data that is of general enough interest to put in there. I'd say if you want more control over the kind of data that you put into Data Commons, including when you add the data and when you take it out, that's a use case for where you might want to consider having your own instance of Data Commons. And that's what we're doing at TechSoup. We're imagining that there's a lot of data that might be helpful to civil society that might not necessarily be of broader general interest. And so those are the types of data sets that we want more control over how we get that data in and out of Data Commons. Is that helpful? Yes, absolutely. In fact, all the pieces of data in Data Commons, it's organized into a knowledge graph. And part of that knowledge graph allows you to specify any sort of properties that you want for a piece of data and to be able to query against any of those properties. So I will say that the tools that are available inside of the datacommons.org website are really geared around looking up statistical information about a specific place. But there's also a ton of data inside of Data Commons which isn't associated with, it's not a statistic or it's not a place. It's data that exists in Data Commons, but it's using a different kind of schema. And if you want to be able to query that, the Data Commons API is probably the best way to do that. And any information that's in data commons, you have a lot of flexibility in terms of what properties you use to extract that data. Okay. Another question over here.
Can I upload a CSV file and do my own query? I upload, then I query to some interesting things.
So right now, any contributions to the data commons data sets go through the Google Data Commons team. I know that that's an area where the team is doing a lot of work to make it easier for people to contribute. I'm not sure if there will be a way for people to kind of self-serve, upload their own data. Again, I think if that's something that's important to you, setting up another instance of data commons is an easy way to do that. But there's not an existing interface right now where you can just upload data and see it immediately in data commons. And I think part of that is really understanding what the right kind of schema and models can be associated with that data set so it can connect to other data sets. So I know that the Data Commons team wants to make sure that everything that's uploaded into Data Commons adheres to a very structured schema. Is that helpful? Yeah. Yeah. That's. Yeah, okay. So now I understand. I think you have your own data. You want to be able to take data that's in Data Commons, figure out how you can combine it with the data that you already have, and be able to do the same kind of analysis. So, like I said, the process of getting data into Data Commons takes a little work. But getting data out of Data Commons is pretty easy. So in your case, what I would suggest is if you find a particular set of data that you're interested in from Data Commons, there are a few different ways that you can grab that data and put it into whatever tool you're already using to hold your data. So it's a little bit of the kind of opposite direction that you're talking about. And the CSV download is one way of doing that, right? You can take that CSV file and then put that into whatever tool contains your data. And maybe I'll show you a couple other options here. So if you're a Google Sheets user, for example, there is a fantastic add-in for Google Sheets. This really blew me away when I saw it. It allows you to, let's say I have my own data in a Google Sheets. It allows you to pull in data from Data Commons and look at it alongside the data that I already have. So as an example, maybe I'm interested, I have a Google Sheet where I want to be able to have a bunch of data in here about food security and health. And maybe I'm focused on the state of Illinois. So in order to, first thing you need to do is you need to install the Data Commons add-in. You can do that by going onto the add-ons menu, click Get Add-ons, and if you just search for Data Commons, you'll see it pop up here. I've already got this installed, so I'm not going to reinstall it. But once you have it installed, in order to enable the connection to Data Commons, you can just open this window right up here. And this will make it so that you are able to put formulas into your Google Sheet to pull data in from Data Commons. So I've already taken a list of counties, all the Data Commons identifiers for these counties, and I'm pulling in a few different data points here, like population, the number of people who are food insecure, the percentage of people with diabetes for each of these counties. And I was able to do this through a simple formula. I can show you how that works. Let's say we're interested in getting data about the number of people who don't have health insurance. So there's a Google Sheets function that you get with the add-in. It's called DCIDs. And this function will take in as a parameter the places that you're interested in getting data for. So I'll just highlight all the counties here in Illinois. And it takes in the name of the statistical variable that you're looking for. In this case, I believe the name of the variable is count person, no health insurance. Okay, so we'll let that go to Data Commons, and you can see this data was pulled back instantly from Data Commons. And in fact, all of the data on this page is coming from Data Commons. This GeoID 17 corresponds to the state of Illinois. But let's say, if I'm interested in California, I can change that to California as GeoID 6. Again, that's the FIPS code if you're familiar with that. And as soon as I change that, then all of the data on my page will automatically update with information from California. It'll update with the names of the places, the counties in California, and for each county, all the variables that I was interested in will update to show the current values from Data Commons. And I think this is a great way if you do have your own data that you want to be able to look at alongside the Data Commons data. A spreadsheet is a great way to do that. Okay, so let's say you don't want to mess with the data at all. You just want to be able to put some of these visualizations and charts up on the web. So there is a web component library for Data Commons that makes this really easy. And I'll show you how that works. So I had Google Bard create a web page for me about energy usage in Europe. And there's some pretty interesting content in here, but the page I think looks a little boring. I feel like we can snazz it up a little bit with some visualizations and some charts. And we can do that through the Data Commons web component library. Let me bring up my HTML for this page. In order to use this library, all you have to do is add this one line to the top of your HTML page. And this will load the web components in to be able to use on the page. So what do the web components look like? Well, there's a bunch of them. They all start with Data Commons as a prefix, and there are tags that correspond to any kind of visualization that you see in Data Commons. So for example, this tag right here is for a map visualization where I can pass in a few parameters. I can say, where do I want data for? In this case, Europe. I want to look at the country level. And the variable that I'm interested in is, let's say, the annual consumption of electricity per capita in Europe. So I can take this tag and then go back to my HTML. And let's say this is where we want to put a chart from Data Commons. I'll go ahead and save that. And now if I go back to my website and I reload, you'll see that my website, just with that single web component, that single tag, is pulling in a bunch of data about electricity per capita in Europe by country, and it's embedding it onto my website. So let's take another example. So if you remember at the top of the, there's a script that you're adding into the top of your page, and that contains all the logic for how those graphs are interpreted. It abstracts out all of the API calls that get the data and place it on the page. So here I've got an example of a bar chart, just to show another example. And let's save that. And then I'll go back to my website and reload this. And there you see the bar chart. And I'm not doing anything fancy here. You can just see this is just a static HTML page. This isn't a web app or anything like that. And And because we're bringing in that web component library, we can very easily add all kinds of interesting visualizations and getting the data without having to work directly in data commons. Here I've got a gallery, if you're interested, of all the different kinds of web components that are available to incorporate into your website. You can see that there's maps and line graphs and highlight tiles. There's a whole variety of types of visualizations that you can look at for whatever the kind of data is, whatever way you're interested in engaging around that data.
Is there a way to get license information about each data type?
So about if there's a piece of data, how to understand what the usage rights are for that piece of data.
Distribution and usage rates.
Yeah, so I know, I'm not sure if we're capturing information about specific usage rights. I know that every piece of data has a provenance associated with it in the knowledge graph. So you can see where did this data come from. And typically that is expressed in the form of a URL where you can go and you can kind of see, what the source was for the data if it came from, let's say, the Center for Disease Control. And you can look up what those usage rights are. I will say that any data that you see in the public data commons will have the most kind of liberal public usage available. And I think that's one of the criteria for putting it in the public data commons. So you can feel pretty comfortable about using anything that you see in the public data commons. And again, if you would like to incorporate more restrictive kind of use data sets into data commons, that also might be a case where setting up your own data commons might be a good place to do that.
I'm just thinking scenarios where something might be shared under an NC license, right? But it's open to researchers, anyone in the world can query it, they don't mind that piece. But then there is a company that wants to use that data, and they cannot under the terms and conditions, right?
Yeah.
So under that circumstances, when we're getting to this, because there's no license information, who has liability?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think I don't have an answer for that, but I think that's one of the problems that comes along with being able to kind of bring all this data into one place. You're naturally going to run into these questions about how is this data able to be used. I know we've had a lot of conversations about civil society data, for example, where you're going to run into a lot of that, and especially as it relates to appropriate use of it and whether it is available for commercial use or not. And so these are all issues that we're grappling with as well. And I think these are all issues that require a little bit of, I think technology work can help in terms of making that more transparent. But also a lot of these questions are kind of broader than that, right? I think these are more policy kind of questions about what kind of data do you want to have in your data commons. So I think that's why in the Google public data commons, they're really kind of leaning on the side of having the most open use possible. So to not have to get into a lot of those issues. But I think that's an area that will just continue to issues like that are going to continue to come up, and I think that's an area really worth paying attention to and exploring. So.
Yeah, in general, the data in data commons has already been published someplace else, and the big thing they've done is normalize across these different data sets. So you could do the kind of query that Steve did in the data download tool, and you're collecting data from a wide variety of different data sets, but you get it back in one spreadsheet. In the docs section, there is a lot on legal and disclaimers. So they have addressed some of these issues. One of the big things we've talked about is what happens if the data changes. Let's say a government goes in and changes how hot it was in August of 1930, so that this August wasn't the hottest August on record, and that August was, right? If you were pulling that data into a spreadsheet, it would just be different the next time you opened your spreadsheet. You wouldn't necessarily have good ways right now of being able to track back and see what caused data to change. So I think as we use it, those are the kind of use cases to surface so that additional tooling can be built around the ability to interrogate the data both for usage, like what you were talking about, but also validity.
Also, I think like trackability, the fact that your the DCID, right, is
Yeah.
a geo ID, but there is no event ID. At the point of change, when the government came in and changed the 1930s record, you can't query that. You can't see like at this point on this date at this time, this government decided to change that record. There is no unique identifier to an event that is within the data, which I would also be curious about because data tampering is an issue.
Yeah.
Someone might go and do that, and it would be very interesting for someone to be able to query and say, how many times has this data changed in place, replacement of that same existing data?
Yeah, so if you take Steve's spreadsheet example, you could imagine an alert popping up if that data has changed within some period of time, because sometimes it's reasonable the data is going to change. Other times less so, but you want the individual using the data to have the ability to interrogate it. Right now, that interrogation comes at the source, right? Versus necessarily the data inside it. So you're saying, okay, I'm going to trust, the National Office of Weather and Atmospheric Events, right? Or the Scottish Space Agency or whoever is publishing this data. One of the things you can do whenever you're looking at the graphs on the page that I think is also interesting, you can download the data, but you can also look and see sources. And often it's giving you the best available, but you can go in and change the source if there are multiple sources for the same data, which is also an interesting experiment because they don't always agree. And that's something we found working with one of our partners actually, is that the data sources about crime statistics didn't always agree across different sources.
Thank you. All right, let's move on. Are there any developers in the room here? Raise your hand. Great, okay. And you all are probably wanting to cut to the chase and figure out how can I use Data Commons in my own code. So let's talk about the Data Commons API. So there are two ways of accessing the Data Commons API. One is through the REST API interface, and then the other way is through a Python library. Let's start out by talking about the REST API. Here you can see the base URL for the REST API. There are really three endpoints that you might use with Data Commons. The resolve endpoint is how you find information about what is the Data Commons DCID for a particular place. And you can give it the name of a place or the coordinates or any information you have around the place, and Data Commons will resolve that and give you the DCID that you're looking for. The node endpoint is how you traverse the knowledge graph. You can do any sort of query on the knowledge graph, get information about the properties or the relationships of any place in the Data Commons knowledge graph. And then the observation endpoint is used to get statistical data about a place. And that might be the one that is most useful to folks in the room, at least initially. So maybe we'll give an example of that. So let me bring up, let's do this in Postman. So you can see in Postman, I've already got this request queued up where I'm calling the observation endpoint. And I'm passing in just a bunch of different parameters you can see here on the query line. It's actually easier to see in this parameter view down here. And I'll point out a few of the parameters. Of course, you need to know well, first of all, start out with the key is actually the API key. So if you want to use the Data Commons API, get an API key from Google. If you look in the documentation, there's also a sample API key that will help you get started. The entity is the place that you're trying to find data for. In this case, I'm putting in a expression that Data Commons knows how to handle, which is show me all the countries that are in South America. So I'm using that as my place indicator. And then you can give it a list of variables that you're interested in. Here, let's say we're interested in internet usage in countries in South America. So I've found a statistical variable, which is about the number of people who are internet users per capita. The date property, here I'm just saying I want the latest data that's available. You can also specify a time range if you're interested in. And these last 4 select parameters just tell you in your response what kind of information do you want returned. So I want to know the place, the variable, the date, and the value of the data point. And let's send this query, and you'll see I get a JSON structure back, which contains all of the data that I asked for. So for example, you can see in Colombia, in 2021, the percentage of internet users was 73%. And in Bolivia, that number was 65%. You can see that for every country in South America. So, the REST API is very flexible, but sometimes it can be a little bit unwieldy. If you work with Python, you'll be very happy to know that there is a Python library for data commons. There's actually 2 Python libraries. There's one which is just a wrapper around the REST API. And then there's another pandas-based library which gives you access to some of the pandas objects when working with data commons data. So you can look at things inside of data frames and things like that. So let me give you an example of what that might look like. I've got a Colab notebook here. I'll connect to my notebook. I'll give it a minute for that to start up. Great. And in this case, let's use the example of maybe I'm interested in examining the rate of water withdrawal in the United States, and maybe looking to see how that's impacted by places that are experiencing drought. So there's really 3 steps to doing this. One is you set up the dependencies, and then you get the data from data commons, and then you can just use the data. So setting up the dependencies is easy. You're just installing and importing the data commons pandas package. So we'll run that. We'll give it a second to install. All right, great. And then once you have that imported, you can use it in your code. So I'm going to show you how to get some data from data commons. If you want to get the DCIDs for all the places that you're interested in data commons, you can use this function called getPlacesIn. And what that will do, let's say I want to get a list of counties in the United States. So that's what this line is, get places in the United States, and I want to look at counties. So let's run that. And you can see that data commons returns a list of the DCIDs for each county. And again, these are the FIPS IDs if you're interested, these geo IDs. So now that you have a list of counties, maybe you want to get a bunch of variables for each of these counties. And you can use a function called build multivariate data frame to do that. And that will return the results in a Panda data frame. So the variables that I'm interested in, for example, are the population, the water withdrawal rate overall, as well as by usage, for example, industrial, irrigation, public supply, thermoelectric. I also want to get some information about drought conditions. And so I can look at a variable called the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which is basically an indicator that tells you how much drier or wetter than normal is a particular area. The lower numbers are more dry, and the positive numbers are more wet. So if I run this, data commons is going to pull information for all of these variables for all of the counties that I have passed in.
It seems to me you need a field name. Where are you getting that field name from? Because it was pre-populated here, right? So if I don't know withdrawal rate underscore water, and if I have a withdrawal underscore rate underscore water,
So
where is the query coming from?
are you asking where am I getting these names from? That's a great question. And so for the moment, this is where you might use the statistical variable explorer inside of Data Commons to find out, given a particular variable that you're interested in, this is the name of the variable to use. So that's a manual process right now. There are ways where you can explore the knowledge graph and look for data that way. But for the moment, it helps to know what the statistical variable is ahead of time. And I think that's where I think part of what we're doing at TechSoup is we're taking different topic areas like climate change or food security, and we're helping to surface what are the variables that might be interesting to people who are working in that space. So you don't have to hunt through the hundreds of thousands of variables that are in Data Commons. So there is a little bit of a combination of exploration and curation that will help get to these variable names. But that's a great question. And you'll see that Data Commons came back with a little matrix here where for each county in the United States, I've got data for each of these variables. And once you have that, this is the fun part, you can just use the data. So in this case, I'm going to use the Folium library to plot some of this information on a map. I'll set up a kind of a blank map using Folium. And then I can take that data and add a layer that corresponds to this drought index. So if I run this code, it'll add a layer. And here you can actually see in a more visual way the more yellow counties are counties where they're experiencing drier than normal conditions. And then the green areas are places where they're experiencing wetter than normal conditions. And so we also have this information about water withdrawal. It might be interesting to overlay that information on top of that map. And here you can see the areas in purple are areas where there are higher rates of water withdrawal. Kind of interesting to look at this. I did this in Folium, but you can imagine being able to use some of the Google Earth Engine libraries that we talked about earlier today to be able to access other data slices or do additional analysis. The GEE map library that was discussed earlier today is another way of pulling data in and working with data that you're getting from Data Commons. So I hope this is all providing some inspiration for you guys in how you might use Data Commons in your own work. There's lots of different ways that you can incorporate it. I definitely encourage everyone to go to Data Commons and just explore on your own. There's a lot of documentation and tutorials up there. You'll also find all the code for Data Commons up on GitHub. If you're interested in looking at that, or if you're interested in setting up your own instance of Data Commons, all the instructions are there. There's also information, more details about the Webb components that you can find in the GitHub repository. So with that, I know we took a lot of questions along the way, but if anyone has some additional questions or comments, would love to. I think we've got a couple minutes left. Yes?
Can you tell us about a particularly exciting way that your team has used Data Commons?
Yeah, do you want to talk about the global network? Some of the...
Sure. Do you want to pull up maybe the Semefi story or the farming? So what we've been doing, so TechSoup is connected to other nonprofit organizations and countries around the world. So what we've been doing with those organizations is going in and saying, okay, how do we use this to illustrate the way you might tell a story about a social issue in your country? So we worked with our partner in Mexico, a nonprofit, a philanthropic organization called Semefi, to tell a story of hunger and gender in Mexico. So this is an instance where we were using the APIs to pull the data in so that we can actually not just display the data, but talk about why it's important to look at it in this way. So this is an example. This is actually the place in which we found inconsistent data from different data sources. So it's a way both to interrogate the data, but to layer in other additional data and resources, and to talk somebody through why that data may be interesting and engaging. I think this is a pretty interesting kind of use case. I will say that I think at the end of the day, what many of the organizations that we work with, the spreadsheet, the ability to pull data points into a spreadsheet, you know, when Steve was putting the API calls into the spreadsheet that returned information about population, the ability to do that and build graphs off it in combination with your own data, I think is going to be tremendously powerful to the organizations we work with, and building templates that get them going, because it's remarkably easy to do once you see somebody go through it.
Talk about how you were able to understand maybe that uneven accuracy between.
Yeah, we didn't understand it. The organization in Mexico did. So when they saw the source that was used in Data Commons, they pointed out that there's another source in the Mexican government, went in and looked at those things and saw the data was inconsistent. And it was essentially about how safe it is or is not to be female and in Mexico. And then they were able to investigate that data and understand that the way people were counting violence and danger was different, right? So they dug in, and what they were using is both their knowledge of the problem, knowledge of where data sources resided, and Data Commons' ability to surface data so they could easily look at it and examine it. Because otherwise they first would have had to found that data someplace out in the world, downloaded it, and figured out ways to look at it. But this tool allowed them to quickly compare that data and then use their local knowledge to understand why it was different, because there are a lot of very legitimate reasons the data could be very different. And so that's I think that's the power of it, is the ability to work with somebody. This organization, they don't have data scientists on board, right? They're not going to do all the engineering work up front to get the data into the state that allows them to have a community conversation. But this allowed them, with some support, to be able to get the data into a state where they could tell a story, they could interrogate that data, discover what's interesting, and then build a story around it that they could communicate out into their community. And that, from our perspective, working with civil society is part of what's exciting. Also, the ability is not so much on that one, but in other ones to go backwards. So somebody looking at the food and farming, like looking at, this is another story that we built with some former interns, actually. But to go in and look at this and have this story in a map, but then be able to click on these counties and go into Data Commons and actually see more data. So again, it provides a starting place for exploration. I think the big thing that we'll see as we go through is about the freshness of the data, you know, and making sure you're actually building things that are comparable. When I was playing with it to make the slides that I made, I was looking for correlations between tornadoes and other kinds of weather events, or median income, or the money spent on building maintenance and repair. And all that data was in there, but the date ranges weren't comparable, right? So you start to lose some of that. But I think that's what, as we use this, that's what's going to improve the tool, right? Using it, reporting back things, finding new data sets, and interrogating it.
Well, thank you all. I know we're at time. I'll stick around, and Marnie will stick around if you guys have other questions. Happy to answer them, but thanks for coming.